Hey, Jody here. We're doing a freehand root and hot pass on 4-inch pipe today, but let me give you just a little bit of context before we get into it. This little technique that I'm about to show you is one that I learned in a weld test shop about 30-something years ago. I had just come off a nuclear job and we walked the cup on everything that we could walk the cup on. Sometimes you couldn't. Well, this particular test shop did not want you to walk the cup on the root pass. They had this special technique they wanted you to do, and that's what I'm going to show today. Let's do it.
The first thing to do is make sure you got a good fit up with an even 1/8 gap and no high-low, also called mismatch. I'm using a bent piece of 1/8 wire like a lot of people do. You've got to realize that that first tack is going to shrink a little bit and it's going to tighten up that gap. So if there's a space that's a little wider than 1/8, that's a good place to put that first tack. And then you have to just kind of massage it a little bit, tap it around, and make sure you got an even gap all the way around and make sure you don't have any high-low. All your tacks should be feathered with a grinder, but not excessively. It's more common to take a 6G test, but 2G tests are still given, and if it's in a test shop, position it where you got a good line of sight. 95 to 100 amps seems to be a sweet spot amperage setting for the root pass. The technique that I'm trying to do here today is a straight forward and back technique without any side-to-side motion. The sides will take care of themselves. I'm just bearing down on the tip of that wire, trying to keep a fairly tight arc, moving the tungsten ahead and then back, and ahead and then back. And the amount I move it ahead and back kind of depends on how tight the gap is. If it's kind of a loose gap, I don't move it ahead very far because it might keyhole. So it's kind of a subtle movement. You could even just really go along at a steady pace, but I find that moving it forward and back kind of plays the light a little bit and helps my eyes focus on everything. That forward and back motion does seem to give you a little bit of an increment to kind of judge your travel speed. It also helps you to kind of scoot the TIG finger along and slide along. You make a nice long run. All right, pretty soon here I'm going to tie into a tack, and I'm using a foot pedal here today just because that was easier to film. But I'm going to show how I would trail out if I was using a scratch start. Just something like that.
Okay, so we're about to light up coming off of a tack now. And this is another little thing that they showed us in this test shop. Light up, put the wire on the end of the tack and fuse it to the tack so that it's making contact so that everything conducts heat, and then back up about 1/8 of an inch and pause for maybe a second or two, and then move forward slowly. And then everything kind of blends together. All right, you'll see what I'm talking about. Let's do it.
I'm going to go full pedal right away here. And here's what I was talking about. I fuse the tip of the rod right there to the end, and I back up a little bit, pause, and then move ahead slowly. And everything just kind of blends together. It makes a nice smooth tie-in, usually without any low place, or you really can't hardly tell if you do it right. But that means feathering the tack, not excessively, just a little bit. That usually works best, for me anyway. This is just one method, many ways to put in a root pass. I'm just showing the method that was taught to me in this test shop way back in the day. The gap in this area is just a little tighter, so you can see I'm moving ahead a little bit further and back a little bit further. Not a lot, but you know, just a little bit more of a distinct movement than before with the wider gap. I'm going to tie into the beginning of the weld here, so I'm going to feather that just a little bit so that I get a nice blended tie in there. Here's another restart, same thing. Always seems to be a little extra oxidation and silicon floating around in the puddle on restarts. If you just kind of wait, usually it'll float to the surface. Take your time, things clean up. I am using ER70S6 filler wire, and I do recommend that for open roots if you have the choice. Sometimes you don't. If a procedure calls for ER70S2, well, that's just what you have to use. But if you got a choice, and sometimes you do, I would always opt for S6 on a root pass. Seem to do a lot better job on root pass. I don't notice a lot of difference in anything other than a root pass, an open root pass, but I do prefer it. Seems to flow in better. There we go. That is the root pass. Let's take a quick look at it. The walls are broken down. It's got a little bit of reinforcement. It's fairly uniform. The hot pass should push it through just a little bit further. I would recommend letting it cool off a little bit before putting the hot pass in, and we're going to do that in just a minute.
A hot pass is called a hot pass. It's not always hotter than you put the root in at. Sometimes it's the same, sometimes it's less. Like on a J bevel, sometimes you can't handle the heat. I bumped it up 10 amps, and that seemed to be about right. But the main goal is to not screw up the root.
After giving it just about 5 minutes to cool off, not spending a whole lot of time on the middle, not bouncing from side to side, but moving fairly quickly across the middle, keeping that rod in the puddle, keeping an eye on the little floating silicon islands and making sure not to trap any. If one looks like I'm going to walk over it, I'll pause for just a second or so and kind of let it float. It is possible to trap a silicon island, kind of weld over it, roll the puddle over it, and that can cause you problems. It can cause porosity sometimes going back over on the next pass because there's a little gas pocket and it'll blow out. It's kind of rare, but it does happen. So keep an eye on those silicon islands floating around. I'm keeping just a little bit of pressure on the rod so that if it does want to take a little bit of rod, if I hang around a little bit too long and things get a little hot, it'll take a little rod and that'll kind of satisfy the puddle and usually prevent suck back on the back side by satisfying the puddle on the front side. Interesting side note here, I'm running off of TIG welding inverter, a CK-MT200 here, and I'm running off 115 volt power and a 20 amp breaker out in my detached garage. Some machines do better than others on 115 volt power. It takes a few minutes to go around this thing at 110 amps, and I can go around it the whole way, never pop a breaker, never have a problem. It's just amazing what it'll do on the 115 side. So it's an option for somebody to get some practice on something like this without having to have 230 volt power in their garage. When I need 230 volt, I can run it from my laundry room, I can reach it with two 25-foot extensions. But when I can get by with 115 volt, why not? It's just a lot more convenient. In fact, I had to trap a mouse that got in the house when I had the door cracked when I was doing that not too long ago. So, it's nicer to be able to just plug into the 115 when I can. It's been a lot of years since I've done this regularly, but I find myself sort of feeling like I'm getting back in the groove right here. This is one of those shots where it shows that silicon island floating around. I'm keeping an eye on it, and I'm trying to manipulate it a little bit by pausing and letting it keep floating instead of rolling over it. So far so good. We're almost done with this pass. We'll take a look at the root pass again after the hot pass. Make sure we didn't disturb it, screw it up in any way. That is the goal. It's a shame to put in a nice root pass and then screw it up with the hot pass. So got to get that hot pass technique down. If I didn't mention it earlier, we always call it a hot pass, but it's not always hotter than the root pass. Sometimes it's actually less. In certain cases, like a J bevel, sometimes you can't even stand the same heat that you welded the root with, or you'll suck it back. In this case, standard 35-degree bevel, it can handle a little heat, so I just bumped it up 10 amps. Probably could have gone a little hotter, but no reason getting crazy with it. This went okay. My TIG finger worked like a champ for this joint. Let me finish it out without cooking my knuckles. That's the goal. Let me concentrate on the weld. Let's take a look at the root pass after the hot pass here. Hot pass pushed it through just a little bit. It's definitely above flush, got a little bit of reinforcement there. All just depends on what the inspector requires. Sometimes they want a lot more reinforcement than this, but sometimes this is what they're looking for, and this usually meets code requirements. You can learn more about my TIG finger and TIG finger XL at weldmonger.com. These are 100% made in USA, made from USA materials.